So I want to speak today about economic theory and moral imagination. As a feminist economist, you're probably not too surprised that I find that standard economics is a bit lacking in several departments, one of which is its relationship to ethics. But I'm going to challenge you a little bit further today, because I'm going to argue that dominant economic theory has not only limited economist thinking, it has actually poisoned the well for the way that people really across most of the academic disciplines think about the economy and ethics. So let me get started. When I speak to groups of non-economists, sometimes there's people that think that the economics discipline, when you're being trained in it, you sit around and discuss Adam Smith and Karl Marx. Or maybe you go out in the world and spend some time in businesses and government agencies to find out how they really run. Not at all. Economics graduate education is all about math. What we call theory, let me see for some reason, oh, here we go. Here's my advanced slide. This would be an example of the typical theory section of a paper. Lots of calculus. Sometimes there might be some game theory. Sometimes there might be some experiments in behavioral economics, but the theory will be laid out this way. And I'm talking about, call it mainstream here. It's basically what's long been called the neoclassical orthodoxy, plus a few things like game theory and behavioral economics. But this is what is taught at universities, unfortunately, really around the world, and certainly in any prestigious graduate department. So that's what we learned as theory, and our typical empirical analysis is to go gather a big bunch of numeric data and use highly sophisticated, although unfortunately too often very poorly understood, econometric techniques to try to test hypotheses, all very scientific sounding. If you read economics textbooks or hang around economists long enough, you realize that there are some key things that define what is economics and what isn't economics. Mainstream economics is usually defined either as being about markets, places where goods and services are exchanged for money, or about individual self-interested rational choice, science of choice making. Usually this is thought of as rational choice. Behavioral economics has put a few details on that maybe were not always entirely rational, but that's still the base model. And it's all about efficiency, how to get the most for the least. The methodology, quantitative, like I said, it's all math, all formal, largely abstract. Economists believe it to be positive as opposed to normative or ethical. There's a strong belief among economists that this approach gives us objective knowledge. I mean, you can't argue with math, right? Of course, that's incredibly naive from an epistemological perspective in philosophy, but economists think of philosophers as those soft folks doing that mushy stuff over there, and themselves as scientists. Sometimes this is referred to as physics envy. We also head for the most general and abstract knowledge we can find. We look down our nose at picking around in details like data collection for ourselves. And the general sense is one of control. The economy is a machine, it's a mechanism. It has drives and certain kinds of energy. And our goal is all about finding the ways to control this mechanical system. Well, the beginnings of feminist economics, there were a few brave pioneers before this, but in the early, late 1980s, early 1990s, some of us started to ask what was left out of this picture. Are there things that characterize the real economy that we live in that somehow didn't make it into this quote unquote economic science? And we drew on the work of philosophers and historians of science, such as Evelyn Fox Keller, Sandra Harding, Susan Bordo, Helen Longino. Sandra and Helen came to some of our conferences early on. We had a great time together because a lot of this critique that a lot of Enlightenment science was really based on prioritizing the masculine and thinking that was superior, and getting rid of anything culturally associated with femininity fit right into economics. So of course, what we're talking about here is science as invented in Western Europe during Enlightenment times. We're going to be dealing with the gender binary all the way through here, and just with this hegemonic strain, really, of Western thought. Not that there isn't, exciting work going on elsewhere about other kinds of thought, about non-binary gender, intersectionality, et cetera. But I'm looking at critiquing the hegemony here. So I'm staying, this talk will be within that framework. So when I looked for what was left out, it was pretty clear. Markets left out social life and family. Mental choice left out bodily experience. You might be surprised that economists never talk about physical needs. Because some people fast voluntarily, food is obviously just a choice. Development economists spend some time on poverty, but it is not a core theme in the discipline. Choice behavior is. Individuality, we forget about our relatedness, our interrelations, our interdependencies. The focus on self-interest forgets that we sometimes do consider effects on other people. Emphasis on reason means we deny emotion. Even things like stock market panics. You would think that emotion would, play some role there, but it gets ignored in the discipline. And the focus on efficiency rules out a couple things. It rules out a focus on fairness, equity. It also rules out ideas of resilience. Resilient systems often have a lot of backup systems. Well, backup systems that never get used look terribly inefficient. All those resources just wasted on things like flood walls, right? So building resilience is quite different from that. If you look at the cultural connotations of these things, and psychologists and others have noticed that we tend to organize a lot of stuff in our brain by gender. And this is really about cognitive gender. This isn't about men and women thinking differently or women being more embodied than men. I think that is all rather silly. This is about how our brains work. And we've mentally associated that left-hand side with masculinity, right-hand side with femininity. We can also look at the methodology. Like I said, if we just look at the math and think we're being positive and objective, we leave out qualitative, verbal, intuitive. We leave out ethics. Ethics seem to people to be subjective, something for argumentation, and economists want to be hard scientists that come up with truly objective truth, rather than reliable knowledge, which would be the more sensible objective. The particular and the unexpected. Economists don't do so well with 1,000-year floods. They want to control the mechanisms for the things that usually happen. The unexpected, Fortuna, a female figure, is not considered, not dealt with very much in the core of the discipline. Now, there's various ways you could take these couple of pictures here. We got a left-hand side, a right-hand side, a masculine side, a feminine side. To most economists, they say, yeah, and of course the left-hand side is all better and harder and more rigorous and good, and the right-hand side is squishy, so we're just going to keep on doing what we're doing. That's one approach. Another one that I sometimes hear is, well, economics profession is dominated by men, and we do the left-hand side, and the women can come in and they can do the right-hand side, because we know women are more emotional, et cetera. I think that's also hooey. I actually do the math quite fine, thank you very much. A third way, and this way I see more in a lot of the critics, not only the economics discipline, but I think we all have some very serious concerns about the way our contemporary economies are going in terms of sustainability. Critics of those sometimes tip a little bit this way, which is, well, that left-hand side has gotten us into all this trouble. Continuing poverty, inequality, ecological disaster, racial strife, everything else we can blame on that left-hand side. And so we need to flip over to this right-hand side. Using math is evil, rationality we should abandon for emotion. That's putting it fairly extreme, but there is a sense sometimes of this really have to dismiss the former and adopt only the right-hand side. I think that's playing with half a deck. I think all of this stuff appears in, all of these things appear in our economic life. The definition of economics I like is Economics is about the way that societies organize themselves for the survival and flourishing of life. That involves all of these things. Certainly involves family. Kids don't survive sitting out there in a market somewhere, right? So I think economies include all of this, and the way to understand economies includes all of this. Sometimes the qualitative is good, sometimes the quantitative, different tools for investigating different things, or combinations of these. So I would like us to be playing with a full deck. The metaphor comes from playing with a deck of cards. Trying to play poker with 26 cards would not work very well. So we want to have the full deck there when we're playing. I'll give you a brief view of sort of an analytical view of what I mean by playing with a full deck. And then later on at the end of the talk, I'll give you a little bit more visual idea of what this means. So the analytical view is something I called a gender value compass I invented a while back. The usual interpretation of that sort of contrast I put up is that one of them is good and the other one is bad. So the masculine side is the good side. We focus on individual choice because otherwise everything's just a big mishmash, soluble, like salt dissolving in water. It's just, you can't find anything. The image of economic man as this radically autonomous, self-interested being, we've come to call the separative self. This was actually borrowed from theologian Catherine Keller. It's a myth. A separative self can't actually live in the world. They actually need to be fed and clothed by somebody, and that traditionally has been a soluble self, a wife who is considered simply a support person. Same thing in business. There's a firm is considered a profit-maximizing entity. All its employees are just somehow soluble in there. They don't appear as independent actors. So what we really need to do to play with a full deck is recognize ourselves as individuals in relation, which you may remember from various kinds of feminist philosophy that's been done. And when we keep in mind that people are in this dynamic tension, both relational and individual, we can get a lot further. In terms of methodology, we can do a similar thing. Math is very precise and elegant. If you just look at the math, it can be very thin and unrealistic. A lot of economic theory doesn't have to do with any economy in the real world. It has to do with an economy that exists in a mental space somewhere, never touches down. Economists don't like language because they consider it imprecise and vague, but sometimes that's the only way to get towards rich and realistic. So could we aim to get the best of both of these, to be as elegant and as realistic as we can be? So that's what I mean about playing with a full deck. Not buying into either one side or the other of this dualism as being the right way and the other way as being the wrong way, and certainly not buying into the idea that men do it one way and women do it the other. So economists have a hard time seeing this. They're very locked into this idea that math gives you objectivity. At best, math gives you internal consistency. There's nothing in there that says it's going to be correct about what's going on in the world. But that's economists' problem. What I see more when I travel around to different disciplines, and I've probably traveled the most into places like sociology and philosophy over the years, is that people have believed economists much too much. Even if you think you haven't, maybe you have. I want to argue that economic theory has essentially poisoned the well from which people all across the academic spectrum and all across the political spectrum have taken their moral imagination about economies. It has poisoned the well about how they think about economies and put poison in the water that everybody drinks about ethics and economics, so that nobody, well, I won't say nobody, but people tend not to see it very clearly. And I want to challenge those beliefs and give you some ideas of moving beyond them. So common beliefs I find about what's going on in economies is that people are purely self-interested in their commercial and business dealings. The businesses are all about making profits. The laws of markets are inexorable, like the laws of physics. law of demand, law of supply. Competition was going to drive out anybody who doesn't profit maximize, these kinds of things. And that social and ethical aspects of humanity belong to a realm separate from business and markets. Business and markets are this mechanical realm that run along their own physics-like rules. If we want to be real full human beings with real full social and moral lives, that has to take place somewhere else. It doesn't happen in the economy. You see a lot of critics of the discipline and of contemporary economies accepting those as facts, right? Economists say this. And so we say, okay, yeah, that's the way people are in economies. So either we have to completely switch to the opposite. Instead of competition, we have to have entirely cooperation. Instead of individuals, we need solidarity and community. Instead of global stuff, we need everything local. And we just have to completely turn the tables. Well, that sort of dualistic thinking comes from believing economists, that the economies really are that way. Or what many of you might also be familiar with is there's a lot of people who propose limits to market, such as Michael Sandel, Virginia Held, Jürgen Habermas. They say, okay, markets and businesses are fine if what's being bought and sold is umbrellas, but if it's education or healthcare, we need to draw the line. And that's not bad as far as it goes, but why does it still allow huge areas of human life to go on being amoral or immoral? It does that because it believes that this market business economy sphere is just as mechanical as economists say. For example, and this is a slide I made based on Habermas's work. I left out the stuff about bureaucracy so much, and I kind of switched sides here, you might notice. But the economic system on the right-hand side is this kind of masculine, macho image of the economy as mechanical, objectified, having mechanisms. These forces that come in from outside, like money, a certain kind of strategic rationality. And there's this evil process of colonization where that is now infecting our life world. And our life world is where we get to be social and human and moral. And that's where we have all of these things that economists consider squishy. I've got some pieces where I talk about why this is just factually wrong. Money actually is entirely a social construction. A currency maintains value only as long as people believe it does. It's entirely a social construct. This idea that it's some outside force just doesn't hold water. To me, this is just staying within that dualism that economists have taught. And I have to say that actually a Marxist view, if you go back and read Marx, falls into the same economic system things. He tried to put everything together with equations and falling rate of profit. He had a mechanical idea about the economy as well. People who think of Marx primarily in terms of economic justice are using Marx many times removed. So I agree with the economic justice part, the mechanical model, not so much. But these beliefs, as I've said before, didn't come from economists going out and examining the economy. They were actually invented. That is, these ideas of firms have to maximize profits, everybody's self-interested, individuals, autonomous individuals, et cetera. And here's a very 1 minute, because I don't want to go too far over time, view of the history of this. John Stuart Mill, who did lots of interesting and broad and feminist things, also wrote a very badly taken article where he actually set out the beginning of what's called Homo economicus, rational economic man. Let's assume that we've got an individual that's only interested in wealth and knows rationally how to get there. He said nobody would ever be, and that's the foundation of a political economy. He said nobody would ever try to apply that without also looking at ethics and social life and everything else. Unfortunately, many people were foolish enough to do that, and that's how we ended up with economics. In the late 1800s, the neoclassicals realized that they could formalize this idea of one person rationally finding their way to the highest wealth using calculus. So that's where we got these cute little graphs to the right. A firm doesn't have management problems, personnel problems, supply problems, connections, none of that. This is a firm to an economist. This is a firm. Just a simple graph. Revenues, costs, the tangent lines in the top graph are parallel. That's the maximum of the total profit line. Boom. We can analyze firms sitting at our desks using calculus. No need to go out and actually find out what firms are doing. And just as one of the great moral failures of economics, out of the same thinking, you couldn't imagine that someone who's purely self-interested would run a company in the best interest of even the shareholders, right? Because they're interested in themselves. So therefore, you have to incentivize CEOs. This is why the top 1% in the US took off away from everybody else from stock bonuses. So one of the big moral failings came straight out of this. And the fact that those things have been believed. The business press, other academics, everybody believes economists when they say that this is just a mechanical ethics-free realm. That helps it keep going. I think I've got a couple minutes past the half hour since we started a couple minutes late. So let me end. And I know I've been talking fast. Sorry, that's why I make a lot of slides. So you can at least follow the slides if I talk too fast. Let's try to expand our, forgot about this slide. If you actually go out and investigate economies, you find out that the opportunistic profit-only ethos is destroying companies and economies. There's a lot of business leaders out there actually saying that. The short-termism drive for quarterly profits is just destroying business in the US. Clearly, as we destroy the environment around us, we are destroying the basis for life, much less business. Firms and economies are social organizations with inherent ethical dimensions. They're not some mechanical sphere out somewhere else. They're part of society, socially and politically organized. Cooperation as well as competition is everywhere. Cooperation often has this good, nice connotation, and competition is angry and mean. Not necessarily the case. When cooperation is between the leaders of large corporate businesses and the government regulators that are supposed to be limiting them, that can be a little bit too much cooperation. That kind of cooperation on the golf course or wherever it takes place can end up hurting everyone else. But economists tend to not look at the cooperation. The key model is still about the competition. Neoliberal, which is our monopoly corporate capitalism that we have right now, which has huge amounts of problems with it, but it is not capitalism with a capital C. It's one form. You look at the history of capitalism, or you look at it across countries, many different varieties. And finally, the work of caring for people and the planet is at the core of sustainable economies. If we really want our economies to last, we've got to take care of people. We've got to take care of the planet we live on. Now, that word care has not come up before. Caring is very much on that feminine, other interested side, very much not an economics word. You also don't see so much of it in traditional philosophy, but I was quite amused when I was reading Hans Jonas, The Imperative Responsibility, so a philosophical take on environmental ethics. And it goes through, all of the big names in philosophy and Kant and, everything else. But when he reasons through all of that, and you get a lot of good philosophical theories, but why should you even care if you have the right philosophical theory? Why should you care about anything at all? And when it comes down to that question, here's the nub he finds. The always acute, unequivocal, and choiceless responsibility, which the newborn claims for itself, creates the ought to do on the part of the subject, who in virtue of their power is called to its care. I put in brackets there because he could apparently only imagine male babies and male adults that have to care for the babies. I gender neutralized that. Caring for a baby. What if we need to care for this planet, care for people? And that fundamental responsibility comes from realizing human weakness. Now, there's a problem the way we usually look at these things. If you Google economy images, and you Google images for care, you end up with something like this. Oh, actually, now I'm going to talk about freeing our moral imagination. First is what you end up if you're not free. You Google those things, you end up with a stock market graph or coins for economics, and you end up usually with a mother and baby for care. Often very white like this, white in race, white in clothing. If you've ever had a baby, you know how dangerous it is to do anything in white. Okay. But that's what you get as our mental images of care and economics. How would you ever get those two together? Totally night and day, totally different. So I'm going to appeal to your moral imagination to finish up with a couple of images. I was thinking about these, and I've resurrected a good old English word and some imagery. I was also thinking about this in terms of masculine responsibility for care. If we think of care in this way, mother and child, it seems like men have to become mothers in order to care. They have to become feminine. I wanted to combat that and say care is everyone's responsibility. So I've tried to revitalize this idea of diligent husbandry. Husbandry is a good old English word that, to the extent it's still around, tends to refer to animal husbandry. That is the care of animals, usually as part of a business, right? You're raising meat or you're raising wool or something like that. But husbandry has this connotation of taking care of the animals or taking care of your crops, keeping a close eye on the weather, paying attention to the details, paying attention to their health. So it has both these productive connotations about producing something and these caring connotations. The shepherd is concerned with the health of the sheep. That is both productive and a form of care. And I argue that women can also be diligent husbands of sheep or of businesses. The CEO does not, as a human being, may not be interested only in money. They may also be a full human being, may also recognize some responsibilities and seek to husband that business, whether that business leader is male or female. But in case we want a somewhat more female-oriented image, let me suggest this one, powerful care. Care is very weak if it depends on mom staying home with baby and all the resources coming in from somewhere else. And it's very limited if it never gets out of the home. So this Michelle Obama on a World War II women in the workforce poster, I love it. Care has to be powerful too. We have to get out there, men and women, and use our strength to move this economy around to something that actually supports people and the planet. So with those images and ideas to stir up your moral imagination, I will end. I've got a few references here. And I guess there is no discussion on this, but you can find my contact information at University of Massachusetts, Boston, and I'd love to hear from people. Thank you.